In 1600, a group of British merchants set sail toward the east with a single purpose: profit. Their company, the British East India Company, had no army, no political power, and no land. They arrived in India with nothing but a royal trading charter from Queen Elizabeth I and a hunger for riches. At the time, India was one of the richest nations in the world, contributing nearly 27% of the global GDP. The country had an advanced economy, a flourishing trade network, and powerful kingdoms like the Mughal Empire in the north, the Marathas in the west, the Cholas and Vijayanagar Empire in the south, and the Ahams in the northeast. So how did a group of foreign traders, outsiders with no military, eventually take control of an entire subcontinent? The truth is, India was not conquered by force alone. It was taken over through deception, bribery, political manipulation, and economic control. The British did not defeat India in battle. They made India defeat itself. And this invasion started long before 1857, with Indian rulers, traders, and soldiers unknowingly allowing the British into the heart of the nation. This is the real story of how India was hijacked from within. The British arrive in India, traders with a hidden agenda, 1600 to 1700. In 1600, the British East India Company, EIC, was granted a royal charter by Queen Elizabeth I, giving it the exclusive right to trade in the East Indies. Their initial focus was spices from Indonesia, but after being outmaneuvered by the Dutch, they turned their eyes toward India, a land of silks, spices, and wealth beyond imagination. At this time, India was not a single country but a collection of powerful kingdoms and empires. The Mughal Empire controlled the north under Emperor Jahangir. The Deccan Sultanates ruled central India. The Vijayanagar Empire, until 1646, dominated the south. The Aham dynasty controlled Assam and the northeast. The British knew they couldn't invade India outright, so they began by securing permission to trade. The first British settlements. In 1608, the British arrived in Surat, Gujarat, requesting permission to trade. The Mughals, seeing no threat, granted them rights to set up a trading post. 1612, after defeating the Portuguese in a naval battle, the British secured a trade monopoly in Surat. 1639, the British built Fort St. George in Madras, Chennai, their first major settlement in South India. 1668, they took control of Bombay from the Portuguese, which would later become their economic capital. 1690, they founded Calcutta, which would become their main headquarters. At this stage, the British had no military power. They were merely traders, but they were laying the foundation for their future takeover. How the British became a political power, 1700 to 1757. The decline of the Mughal Empire, a window of opportunity. For nearly 200 years, the Mughals ruled over a vast, wealthy empire. But after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, the empire began to weaken due to overexpansion and high taxation, draining the treasury, wars against the Marathas, Rajputs, and Sikhs, leading to military exhaustion, weak successors who failed to control the empire's vast territories. With the Mughals weakening, the British used a new strategy. They started playing Indian rulers against each other. Divide and rule. How the British manipulated Indian rulers. The British knew that India's strength was also its weakness. It was not a single united country. The subcontinent was divided into various kingdoms, nawabs, and sultanates, each with its own ambitions. They bribed local rulers to grant them trade monopolies. They created rivalries between Indian kingdoms, weakening alliances. They meddled in succession disputes, backing rulers who were loyal to them. The British did not need to fight India. They made India fight itself. This strategy led to one of the biggest turning points in Indian history, the Battle of Plassey in 1757. The Battle of Plassey, 1757, the British take over Bengal. The richest province in India falls by the mid-1700s. Bengal was the richest province in India, producing 1/3 of the country's GDP. The British wanted control over its resources, textile industry, and massive revenue. In 1756, Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah of Bengal attempted to remove British influence. In response, the British, under Robert Clive, launched an attack on Bengal. How the British won. Bribery, not military strength. The British did not win the battle through military superiority. They won it through treachery. Clive bribed Mir Jafar, the Nawab's commander-in-chief, promising to make him the next Nawab. When the battle began, Mir Jafar and his troops refused to fight, allowing the British to win easily. Siraj-ud-Dawla was captured and executed. Mir Jafar became the new Nawab, but he was only a puppet controlled by the British. With Bengal under British rule, the real looting began. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Bengal, the richest province in India, became the first major victim of British economic exploitation. The British East India Company, which was initially a trading entity, now had direct control over Bengal's administration. But they were not governing to develop the region. They were there to drain its wealth to fuel the British economy and the Industrial Revolution in England. Once Bengal was under their rule, the British imposed an oppressive taxation system, designed not to help the people, but to extract maximum revenue. Taxes were increased by nearly 300% in many areas, leaving farmers unable to survive. Traditional landowners were replaced by British-appointed zamindars, who collected excessive revenues and sent most of the money to Britain. Farmers were forced to grow cash crops like indigo, jute, and opium, rather than food grains, which led to severe food shortages. Under British rule, Bengal's economy was redesigned to serve British industries. India was forced to supply raw cotton, indigo, and other materials to British factories, but was not allowed to manufacture its own finished goods. High tariffs were imposed on Indian textiles, making it impossible for Indian goods to compete with British imports. By 1770, British policies ensured that India became just a supplier of raw materials, while finished products from British mills flooded Indian markets. Before the British arrived, Bengal was the center of the world's finest textile industry. Muslin from Dhaka was so fine that it was called woven air and was highly valued in Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. But under British rule, the textile industry collapsed due to severe restrictions on Indian textile exports, while British machine-made textiles were imported duty-free. Brutal suppression of Indian weavers, many were forced to abandon their craft and take up farming instead. Inhumane punishments for weavers. Some historical records suggest that British officers cut off the thumbs of skilled weavers to stop them from competing with British industries. The once thriving textile industry of Bengal was deliberately destroyed, leading to mass unemployment and poverty. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770, a man-made disaster between 1769 and 1773, Bengal experienced one of the deadliest famines in Indian history, killing nearly 10 million people, one-third of Bengal's population. But this was not a natural famine. It was caused by British economic policies. Farmers were forced to grow indigo and opium, which were highly profitable for the British, but were not edible. The British did not provide any relief or reduce taxes during the famine, choosing instead to increase revenue collection. Food prices skyrocketed, and millions starved to death while British officials continued to export grain to England. This famine weakened Bengal permanently, making it easier for the British to expand their control over other parts of India. But Bengal was only the beginning. The British used the same exploitative strategies across India, leading to widespread poverty and economic ruin. The expansion of British rule, how the company conquered all of India, 1800 to 1857. Once the British had firmly established control over Bengal, they expanded their rule across the rest of India using a combination of 1. The doctrine of lapse, a policy to annex Indian states without war. 2. Direct military conquests, defeating major Indian kingdoms in battle. 3. Betrayal and political manipulation, using Indian allies to weaken strong rulers. The doctrine of lapse, how the British annexed Indian kingdoms without war. Introduced in 1848 by Lord Dalhousie, the doctrine of lapse was a colonial policy that allowed the British to annex any Indian kingdom where the ruler died without a male heir. This was a direct violation of Indian traditions, where adopted sons were considered rightful heirs. Using this policy, the British forcefully annexed several major kingdoms, including Satara in 1848, Sambalpur in 1850, Nagpur in 1853, Jhansi in 1854, despite the protests of Rani Lakshmi Bai, who later led a revolt against the British, and Awadh in 1856, a kingdom that had long been an ally of the British but was betrayed and forcefully taken over. This policy created widespread resentment across India, as many princely states realized that they could be annexed at any time. The Anglo-Maratha Wars, 1775 to 1818, the end of the Maratha Empire. The Marathas were one of the last major powers resisting British expansion. After the fall of the Mughals, they had become the dominant power in India, ruling over large parts of the country. The British fought 3 Anglo-Maratha wars between 1775 and 1818. The Marathas, led by Peshwa Baji Rao II and the Scindias of Gwalior, fought bravely but were ultimately defeated. By 1818, the British had completely dismantled the Maratha Confederacy, marking the end of Indian control over large parts of the subcontinent. The Anglo-Sikh Wars, 1845 to 1849. The fall of Punjab. The Sikh Empire under Maharaja Ranjit Singh was one of the strongest and most organized forces in India. But after his death in 1839, internal conflicts weakened the empire. The British fought 2 wars against the Sikhs in 1845 and 1849. Despite fierce resistance from Sikh warriors, including the legendary Akali Nihangs, the British won and annexed Punjab in 1849. Resistance across India. The Forgotten Freedom Fighters, 1757–1857. Southern India's struggle against British expansion. While Bengal fell in 1757, the British had to fight for decades to conquer South India. Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan of Mysore, 1767–1799, fought 4 wars against the British. The Polygars of Tamil Nadu, Kattabomman, and Maruthu Pandiyar led armed rebellions against British rule. Kittur Rani Chennamma's revolt, 1824, an armed rebellion against the doctrine of lapse after the British refused to recognize her adopted son as heir. Uyalawada Narasimha Reddy's revolt, 1806–1847, a revolt against the British East India Company in 1846. The Pahasi Raja Rebellion, also known as Kerala Varma, he led guerrilla warfare against the British in the Malabar region. By 1857, most of India was under British control. However, the Indian people had had enough, leading to the largest anti-colonial rebellion the British had ever faced. The early wars of independence before 1857. The Sannyasi Rebellion, 1770s, Hindu monks and peasants fought against British exploitation. The Paika Rebellion, 1817, in Odisha, led by Bakshi Jagabandhu, this was a large-scale anti-British uprising. The Vellore Mutiny, 1806, one of the first major revolts by Indian soldiers against British rule. The fight against British rule did not begin in 1857. It had been happening for nearly a century before that. The revolt of 1857 was not just a soldiers' mutiny. It was a mass uprising against British rule, involving kings, soldiers, peasants, and common citizens from across India. A sepoy in the British Army, Mangal Pandey was among the first to openly rebel against British officers in Barrackpore, sparking widespread unrest among Indian soldiers. On March 29, 1857, he attacked British officers, refusing to use the Enfield rifle cartridges greased with cow and pig fat, which was against Hindu and Muslim beliefs. His defiance led to his execution on April 8, 1857, but his actions inspired the larger rebellion that soon spread across India, marking the beginning of the First War of Independence. In Meerut, Indian soldiers revolted against their British officers. In Delhi, Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, was declared the leader of the rebellion. Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, Tantia Tope, and Nana Sahib led fierce battles against the British in central India. Kunwar Singh in Bihar, Begum Hazrat Mahal in Awadh, and Bakht Khan in Delhi led uprisings in their respective regions. The British recaptured Delhi and executed Bahadur Shah Zafar's sons. Rani Lakshmibai died fighting bravely at the Battle of Gwalior. Thousands of rebels were executed, villages were burned, and entire towns were destroyed. In 1858, the British dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India under the British Crown. India was no longer just a company-controlled land. It was now a colony of the British Empire. The British never won India through war. They won it through deception, manipulation, and economic control. In the next episode, we will reveal how the British looted India of $45 trillion, turning the world's richest nation into a land of famine, poverty, and debt. Stay tuned for Part 3, The Looting of India, How $45 trillion was Stolen.